Welcome to PHADA's Hot Topics from Washington webinar. Today's program will be a panel discussion with PHADA's policy staff covering some of the most important topics and issues affecting the industry professionals today. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to review the logistics of today's event. First, we will be taking questions throughout the panel discussion, and at any time during the program, please use the Q&A link in the toolbar to submit your questions. We ask that you not use chat as we will not be monitoring this for questions. All publications and resource referenced in this event will be included in a PDF resource document that you will find linked in the chat box. A recording of the webinar will be available on PHADA's website following today's presentation. And finally, as a reminder, the discussions in this webinar are not for media use. For quotes and more information, please contact PHADA directly. And now I would like to introduce PHADA Executive Director Tim Kaiser, who will present the agenda for today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining what we think will be a very timely webinar this afternoon. The issues on the screen, we will cover them in brief with our policy team. They include the 24 appropriations bill, Inspire, the latest on HOTMA, the Build America, Buy America Act, tenant screening and criminal records, changes we expect HUD to propose this year, the fair housing rule, the latest on the 30-day notice and related issue of TARs, and the Section 3 rule. And then we will cover additional topics if time permits. And we encourage questions, as Blake said, through the Q&A channel. So I'd like to introduce the PHADA staff and ask them to join me now. We have with us today Julie Piccolo, Michael Webb, David Weber, and Crystal Wojciechowski. The first issue that we want to discuss is, I think, the most timely. Just yesterday, the Senate and the House released what we hope is the final appropriations bill for FY24. We are now more than 5 months into fiscal year 24, and Congress is working to finalize the legislation now. We expect it will be considered later this week, and PHADA sent out an email alert to all members today, which will be available on our breaking news channel as well. So you'll want to look at that. But I'm going to ask Michael Webb to just give us a quick overview of the legislation and talk a little bit more about the contents and the timing.
Yeah, so thanks, Tim, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, excuse me. So the bill is, I think, really what we expected it to be in terms of appropriations relative to where we're sitting right now in terms of the debt ceiling. So if you remember last year, there was quite a bit of news about the debt ceiling agreement, which is called the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which have put in place some fairly strict spending caps where fiscal year 24 approach had to be roughly equivalent to fiscal year 23, and then we can only have a 1% increase for next year. And so appropriators really had their hands tied in a lot of ways in terms of giving out money, discretionary money this year. So when we look at the deal that was announced yesterday, what we see is modest increases to both public housing operating funding, about 7%, and voucher renewals, they're up about 8%. And both of those figures are going to be largely in line with increases in rental costs. Where we're much more concerned is on the capital fund, which was funded flat relative to fiscal year 23, which I know none of your agencies have flat material costs or flat construction costs, and voucher administrative fees, which are actually down about $7 million compared to last year. And again, I know none of your agencies have flat salaries or flat operating costs. And so we're pretty concerned about those numbers. And then moving beyond the core HUD programs, we see some very sharp cuts to choice neighborhoods, which only got $75 million compared to $350 million the year before, and home funding, which got a 17% haircut relative to the year before. But then on the other hand, we did see some increases in terms of self-sufficiency program funding. So FSS is up about 13%, and the Ross program is up about 14%.
And Michael, would you talk briefly about just a couple of the important policy provisions that are included in this legislation?
Yeah, gladly. So there's some policy provisions that have been included previously. So the Section 8 student role is still in the bill for those of you in terms of rent certifications. Also exempting smaller housing authorities from asset management requirements. But in terms of some of the new ones, there's quite a few that PHADA supports that are either continuations from previous appropriations bills or are new for this year. So for the original moving to work agencies, their contracts were extended from 2028 to 2038, so they got a 10-year extension on their contracts. For RAD, the sunset date of RAD was extended out to 2029. And for those of you who have done or are considering doing RAD Section 18 blends, there's some provisions in there that we think will simplify those conversions going forward. And there's also provision, and this has been included in previous years, but PHADA very strongly supports it, which prohibits HUD from making funding decisions for FSS based on its performance metric system, which it's revised, it's now calling the FAM score. And we've covered that in the Advocate previously, this new performance metric system.
And what are we hearing on the scheduling of the votes on this week, Michael? When do we expect this to go?
So everything, particularly with this Congress, everything is very tentative. But what we're hearing is that the House is going to vote on it on Wednesday. We're expecting it to pass with bipartisan support. Certainly most if not all Democrats will vote for it, and a sizable number of Republicans will vote for it. Because it's coming to the House floor under what's known as suspension, it will need 2/3 of the House to vote affirmatively for it to pass. And then we expect the Senate to take it up either later on Wednesday or on Thursday, and then for the president to sign it probably on Friday. And the current CR, it must be signed by Friday, or we could in theory have a shutdown, but no one is anticipating a shutdown.
Right.
Everyone's anticipating this will pass, both the House and Senate, and the president will sign it.
So when they finish this bill, it's right on to FY25 deliberations. The president gives his State of the Union address Thursday. And then I think next week, the president will propose his budget, I believe, for the fiscal year 25 budget. And that fiscal year begins on October 1st, right?
Yeah, it's very much out of the frying pan into the oven when it comes to appropriations. As Tim mentioned, the State of the Union is coming up. We have heard that the president will be releasing his budget request on March 11th, which is a week from today. If it's anything like last year, that request on March 11th will be very much focused on top line numbers and administration priorities. And then probably a week or two after that, we'll get the full justification for the president's budget request. And we'll obviously be covering that in the Advocate and in Breaking News.
I just want to mention, and then Blake, if we have any questions on the budget, I do want to mention and emphasize your point that this bill includes about $2 billion in additional funding just to renew the cost of current vouchers because of increases in rents. It's very disappointing, though, as you mentioned, that the admin fee is slightly reduced. And of course, we're in a period of still rising inflation. That's going to be really challenging for agencies, and it's disappointing. And it almost seems contradictory in that HUD and the Congress want to emphasize lease ups, which is understandable, but then they don't give PHAs the resources they need to execute those lease ups. So that is disappointing. Blake, if we don't have any questions on the budget, and I would again reiterate the point that we did send out an alert in writing on this morning. You can take a look at that. We'll cover it more in the Advocate. But do we have any questions on the budget, Blake?
We we just got one in. This is from Cindy Neighbor. What's the admin fee reduction percentage amount?
Hi, Cindy. It's less than 1%. So it's essentially flat. It's a $7 million reduction. If the specific number, it is a 0.3% reduction relative to fiscal year 23.
And if Cindy may be also wondering about what the proration might be, I don't know what that is off the top of my head. The last I saw, we were what, in the high 80% range, I think, for admin fee proration. But we'll definitely look into that further. But it's as I said, it's disappointing. Anyone want to make any additional points on the appropriations bill before we move on?
Tim, if you don't mind, I just maybe want to highlight one more thing, which is
Sure.
public housing shortfall funding, which has certainly been a priority of PHADA, priority of the other industry groups as well. HUD every year publishes the shortfall need, and if I remember correctly, it's well into the $300 million range. And once again, the funding this year is just $25 million, which is just a drop in the bucket. And those funds, like they are most years, are prioritized towards smaller PHAs. And so again, this is just another example, like another disappointing example of the funding just not meeting the need that's out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll talk about the main reason for the shortfall is rising tenant account receivables. And we believe that 30-day notice rule. So the next topic that we want to cover is INSPIRE, the national standards for physical inspections in real estate. And Crystal Wojciechowski is our resident expert on that. Crystal, what's REACT's schedule? I know PHAs are starting to get contacted about their INSPIRE inspections. So what's the current schedule? And can you just clarify when the program applies to those who run voucher programs?
Yes. So a little different. We met with the department a few weeks ago. We talked to Ash Sheriff. We asked her to give us an update because previously we had the scheduling of inspections was based on fiscal year end. HUD had told us 3/31 and June 30th is where they were prioritizing inspections for public housing and multifamily. Over the last couple of weeks when we met with Ash Sheriff, she gave us an update on that. And the update from HUD is that they have completed approximately 1,500 inspections at over 250 properties across the US, and that they're no longer using that fiscal year end date as the driver for inspection scheduling, but rather using what she called their ideal future dates. So based on the 3-2-1 rule for inspections, based on your previous past score. So for those agencies with 3/31 and June 30th fiscal year end dates, I would say at this point to just forget about that and start thinking through what your previous past score was and how long it has been since your last inspection. And that's when you can start to anticipate future inspections for public housing and multifamily. As far as the voucher program, so the voucher program's compliance date is October 1st of 2024. So you have approximately 5 more months to get your agencies prepared. So that would include training your staff and those completing the inspections. That would include educating your landlords and also your residents on what they can expect for an INSPIRE inspection. And so you do have the option to implement sooner than October 1st. So October 1st is the last date. But if you decide to implement sooner, if you're ready to go, I know there are some agencies that would rather do that. They can do that anytime. They just need to notify the department. There's an INSPIRE email address. And so if anyone is looking to implement sooner than October 1st, just let us know and we can send you that information.
Okay. And of course, the issue of tenant caused damages has always been a major issue for PHADA members. How is HUD handling that under the INSPIRE program? The issue of tenant caused damages.
So I would say that's a little unclear as far as how HUD is handling it. We have heard when we met with members at our last conference that the inspectors are handling it inconsistently. So that is an issue. We, PHADA, were disappointed. We had hoped to see some more detailed response from the department on tenant caused damages in the administrative notices for public housing and the voucher program. We did not get that. What we had hoped would provide more clarification for inspectors. What the administrative notice for public housing states, there is an awareness of tenant-owned properties, so things like refrigerators that the tenant owns. And there is specific language related to that inspectors should not be citing any tenant-owned items or articles, so long as they are not considered components of the unit. So an example, and HUD actually uses this in the notice as the example, is a picture with broken glass. So if you walk into a unit, the inspector sees a broken mirror, broken picture frame, they should not be marking that as a deficiency for at any time, unless it can affect the performance related to fire safety system or puts the building at risk. We have heard conflicting information, so I think that's really not necessarily, it's conflicting based on the inspector. So we really need to, I believe that HUD needs to better train the contract inspectors. And we are currently working on getting a meeting with Ash Sheriff in the future to go over some of these very specific incidents so that they can then communicate out to the contract inspectors. So if your agency has had an Inspire inspection and you've seen a deficiency related to like a tenant-owned property or tenant-caused damage, definitely reach out to us, because then when we meet with Ash Sheriff, we can bring up some of these very specific examples so that they can communicate to the contract inspectors. So not exactly what we hoped as far as guidance from the department, but at least we can, our hope is that we could work with the department through REAC to get some of this clarified for the inspectors.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that last point about our members reaching out to you and the rest of the staff if they have issues that come up, and not just on tenant caused damages, but any inspection related problems that you encounter. Please let us know and we can communicate those concerns to HUD. I definitely want to encourage agencies to do that.
And the reason for that really is the language in the Inspire standards. You know, HUD felt that it's more clear, but if it's not clear on the ground, we need to let them know so that they can adjust those standards moving forward for sure.
And I see we have a question from somebody. Who do I reach out to? That would be Crystal Wojciechowski. Don't ask me how to spell that last name, but her email address is on this channel. And then I see we have another question. Is there any data or a survey from PHAs that have already implemented Inspire for their voucher programs? I'm not aware of any data yet. I will say that I have heard from a lot of members that are very concerned about instituting Inspire in their voucher program, specifically as it relates to the potential that we might lose more owners from participating in the voucher program. I was recently at a Pennsylvania state meeting, and a number of audience members brought that up to myself and the NARO CEO. And so I think that's an issue. The leaderships of the national organizations are meeting in about 2 weeks to discuss a variety of policy issues. And one of them may be further delay on the implementation in the voucher program because of fear of the loss of owners. We'll have to see, but I can tell you that is a major concern. And then Crystal, on scoring, of course, we had requested advisory scores, given that this is a whole new system and it's untested, and we want to see how it works first. But HUD rejected that. So what's the status of scoring, and how is HUD planning to issue these scores?
Also, the public housing and multifamily, I think from HUD's perspective, they were under enormous pressure from Congress because they had been tasked tasked with implementing, and aligning standards. So they really needed to get this off the ground after I think we've counted 7 years at this point since congressional intent. So as far as their argument is that they would not agree to our advisory scores because they were offering some things like the affirmative requirements, and there are certain things in the Inspire standards that HUD has determined they won't score, like smoke detectors and things like GFCIs. Some affirmatives that will never be scored to our knowledge, and then others that will be scored in after the first year. And so that is really designed for agencies to get all of those changes made so it doesn't ultimately affect their first Inspire score. So that has been helpful for the voucher program, having that delay through October 1st, which a year ago was, I think, a win, but now 5 months away, it's still very close. And to respond to the question, I am not aware of any agencies that have implemented Inspire at their in their voucher programs at this time. There may be some out there, but just none that I'm aware of. And I know, so agencies are really taking that time to train their staff. But I would just say that even though we did not get advisory scores, that the more information you can provide to us during this time, especially during this first year, we really are going to advocate not just on policy issues, but even things specifically to the standards so that we can make recommendations to the department to clarify things and attempt to provide relief. A final note is I have heard from those public housing agencies that have had public housing or agencies who have had public housing Inspire inspections, that while they have had some issues with the contract inspectors, their scores, they were surprised that they did actually pretty well under Inspire. I know it becomes more complicated with the voucher program and landlords and keeping landlords in the program. So that is something we'll need to watch very carefully, which I think is all the more reason to educate your landlords as soon as possible so you know their concerns up front before October 1st. But we have seen, despite some of the smaller issues related to the inspections or individual inspections, scores have not gone drastically to our knowledge. So that is a positive.
Okay. Why don't we do one question, Blake? I saw some pop up. We have time for maybe one question on Inspire, if you would.
Sure. So this first one is with level CFP funding, capital fund funding, even in the wake of high inflation and high construction costs. What does HUD expect PHAs to do to properly prepare for these white glove inspections? So are Inspire inspections more relevant to HUD than property capital needs? And is the goal to move everyone to the Section 8 platform? And if so, the writer says it's not the way to do it.
Yeah, that's a lot to cover in a brief time. I think the writer makes a good point, though, that the department and Congress are asking for a lot in terms of performance and inspections, and they're not providing the resources that PHAs need. And this is something that we will continue to remind the department of course, during the budget and appropriation season. As far as the other questions, we will respond to all questions. We may not have time to get to them right now, but we will definitely, following the webinar, address all of the questions. I do want to move on to another very important topic, and that's the Housing and Opportunities Through Modernization Act, otherwise known as HOTMA. And I wonder, Michael, can you just give us a brief update? What are the key dates at this point for HOTMA implementation?
Yeah, so the key date that I think we're all working towards is the HOTMA compliance date for sections 102 and 104, which I refer to as the drop dead date. So the date that you have to have provisions implemented by, as of now, is Jan 1, 25. So this upcoming Jan 1 is the date that you have to be in compliance with HOTMA 102 and 104. And HUD has established this rolling schedule for PHAs to update their plans, their ACOPs, and their admin plans. And the first tranche of those are agencies with a fiscal year end date of June 30th. And for those agencies, your plans have to be updated by 75 days before June 30th, so mid-April. So Ideally, you should already have those revisions in place, and those should be out for public comment, if not now, in the very near future.
Can you speak to the feasibility of this timeline, Michael? You recently wrote a letter on FADA's behalf to the department expressing concerns, and I wonder if you would just speak to the concerns we have relative to the feasibility of HUD's current timeline.
Yeah, so the timeline is, I think, ambitious is too weak a word. I think bonkers is maybe a more appropriate term. So in order to be able to implement HOTMA 102 and 104, agencies have to switch over to the Housing Information Portal, or HIP, which is the successor system to PIC. And HUD has been developing HIP for years and years and years. It is not ready yet. It is not really even in a beta testing environment yet. Our letter goes into many of the tasks that HUD has remaining for HIP, including the fact that there's no public housing inventory in it right now. And HUD is expecting this to roll out in April, which is a month away. There's no rollout schedule. There's no data migration schedule. The vendors don't have all the information they need to update their software, and then they've got to work with their clients, public housing authorities, to plan to roll that out. And all of this has to happen by October, in order for agencies to be ready to implement HOTMA by Jan 1, because HOTMA will go into effect for your Jan 1 effective recerts, and your packets for those are going to go out in late October, early November. And so we just don't think the timeline is feasible. And the letter that we wrote, and there should be a link to that in the resources document that goes out after this webinar, really lays a lot of our concerns out.
And I can assure members that'll be another issue that'll be on the leadership agenda is HOTMA and the current implementation timeline. I think the reality is the department's not going to be able to meet its objectives, and it's just not workable for PHAs in any case. So we will be on top of that, of course. Lastly, Michael, there was a recent development on that difficult issue of the asset limit, and HUD has now, I think, as a result of good collaboration amongst the industry groups, has changed its position on the asset limit. Can you just describe that briefly, please?
Yeah, so just very briefly, Section 104 of HOTMA establishes an asset limit that families with over $100,000 in net family assets, excluding retirement accounts and college savings accounts, are ineligible for assistance. But when you read the statute gives PHAs quite a bit of flexibility in implementing that asset limit for currently assisted families, not for new admissions, but for currently assisted families. And so, Tim, as you noted, last year, the industry groups, PHADA, NARA, CLAFA, the MTW Collaborative, wrote a letter to HUD objecting to its planned implementation guidance, which would not have given PHAs that flexibility. And I know a lot of PHADA members, including Cindy Neighbor, who I know is on the webinar, really pushed us to write that letter, and I think their advocacy and their stories were really impactful. And so HUD, just within the last month, did update the HOTMA implementation notice, which I believe is PIH 2023-27, and it does give housing authorities 4 implementation options for the asset limit, again, just for currently assisted families. There's not that flexibility for new admissions, but essentially gives housing authorities the ability to not implement the asset limit for currently assisted families, to implement it, but to give families 6 months to cure or to come back into compliance with the asset limit, or to have, I think, what they're calling targeted enforcement, where you exempt certain households, for instance, elderly households, disabled households, from the asset limit, but you still do implement the asset limit for other households, again, provided that those exceptions are in compliance with fair housing rules. So again, I think this actually was a win for the industry groups, including PHADA, and I do want to thank our members who really did push us, Cindy Neighbor, and there were others, to engage on this issue.
Definitely. So Blake, do we have any 1 or 2 questions on HOTMA?
We actually have quite a few on Inspire, which I think we can mention. We'll just talk more at the end. Yeah,
we'll deal with those at the end if we have time. we'll now move on then to Build America, Buy America, otherwise known as BABA. And Crystal Wachikowski's covering that issue as well. Crystal, when does BABA apply to most PHAs? Can you describe that?
Yes, so we had a milestone, February 22nd. So last month, BABA is applicable to iron and steel. So that would not apply to most agencies, but just to keep that in mind, if you're doing any big construction projects with iron and steel, that took effect February 22nd. But for most agencies and for the remainder of the types of federal financial assistance, BABA will apply on August 23rd of 2024. So this year. And a note, because there is some confusion about when it's awarded versus when it's obligated and expended. So it becomes applicable to you when it is awarded. So not necessarily when it was obligated or expended. So anything you may have been awarded in the past, if you have not obligated or expended it, until later this summer, you're still not required to comply with BABA.
I think that's a very important point that we'll continue to remind members about. Can you talk briefly about the type of waivers that will be available to agencies? There are some good ones that will be of some help in this situation.
Yes. So the two that are of most help, the first is the public interest de minimis, small grants and minor components. So for if your agency receives $250,000 or less in capital funds, BABA does not apply to you. If maybe your agency receives more than that, but your infrastructure project is less than $250,000, then you are not required to comply with BABA. So that should have a pretty big impact on small agencies, small to medium-sized agencies, particularly. Because HUD has stated that roughly half of the capital fund grants are already exempt just by virtue of the amount that you receive. The second is exigent circumstances. So if your agency is in a position in which the health and safety of your residents, something related to, just an example could be elevators, and so it's a health and safety issue, you are not required to comply with BABA if you need to make quick decisions to act on their behalf for their health and safety. The department does not include so you do not need to take any action in order to qualify for these waivers, but I would recommend that you put something in a file notating that you utilized this waiver given the particular circumstances of the use of funds. But you're not required to request either the de minimis or the exigent circumstances waiver, so that there's no additional effort on your end to do that, except possibly just notating for your records. And then the third is more of a case-by-case specific waiver, where if you have determined based on, maybe the added cost, or it's in the public interest to not comply with BABA for various reasons, whether it's cost or delays to your project, you can apply for a very specific waiver for a project directly to HUD. And those waivers do require an application, so there is a process, and they could take up to 60 days. HUD is stating 30 to 60 days for approval because there is a requirement for public comment. So there are case-by-case options, but there is a little bit of effort that the agency would need to put in order to apply for that waiver.
And how can PHAs document that they are complying with the Buy America preference at this stage?
Yes, so there is actually some guidance in PIH Notice 2024-01. So that's the HUD's implementing guidance for BABA. HUD, I believe, is going to implement additional guidance in the future, but that notice does exist, and it states, it's a little bit vague. For example, it states that you would calibrate your approach to document compliance based on the level of complexity of your infrastructure project. And the department does go through an example or two, so I encourage you to look at that, going through Google searches to find products, and really just doing your due diligence to adequately confirm that a project was purchased in compliance with the Buy American preference. So that makes sense to me, except there really is not a current sourcing marketplace that could provide to you details about whether something was manufactured in the US. So there's a little bit of a gray area at this time. We've brought this up to the department. We've mentioned that lots of times. Robert Dalzell at the department has stated really that you should at this time use your standard method to seek products. And if you cannot find those products, that you just notate and keep track of your search process to find them prior to seeking a waiver, because you will need to request, you will need to provide that information to the department when you do request the waiver. So that's not super helpful, but that is the guidance that HUD has provided to date.
So you get the good fortune of writing our comments on HUD's request for information, which are due in mid-April. You might want to put a plug in for members to contact you if they have good source information that they can send you.
Yes, and so the request for information was released by the department last month. We're currently working on our comments. We really would love for your input as well. In the latest edition of the Advocate, we did include a simplified version of the request for information that you could potentially share with your contractors, your architects and engineers. HUD is looking for very specific information about products and materials, which they could then use to maybe implement broad waivers for agencies. So this information could potentially be very helpful for the industry. And so I encourage you to take a look at the Advocate, maybe share those templates that we've created, and then ensure that when you do submit your comments that you also forward that to us so that we can work those into our comments as well. And if anyone is interested in meeting with me to go over some of the maybe issues related to reporting or finding products, please let me know, because I am going to be having some meetings, just some brainstorming sessions with members later this month to work on our comments together.
And I see a quick question. If a PHA gets less than 250,000 in capital funds, are they exempt from BABA?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. I know we're moving rapid fire through these topics, but there's a great deal of information on the PHADA website. And I invite all members, as always, to contact PHADA's staff to schedule, phone meetings and discussions with them. We're always available to talk with you if need be. Next, we're going to move on to tenant screening and criminal records. I believe we're expecting a potential HUD change in policy soon. So David, can you talk a little bit about, does HUD in fact plan to change regulations around this issue, and what do we think the timing is on?
Yeah, well, we think so. They've said they were going to issue some rulemaking around this. We thought it probably would have been out by now, so we're not sure what the delays are. It could be any day, or it could be not for months. So it is hard to say, and it's not entirely clear what they're going to propose in that rule. Based on the past work and the guidance and the discussions we've had, it looks like they probably will try to. They're not going to make any drastic changes, I don't think. They're not going to prohibit the use of criminal background records. What they are going to do is maybe try to strengthen that a criminal record alone may not be adequate, to tighten up on the length of look-back periods, and really just continuing to encourage agencies to review their policy and procedures in their local context to give fair opportunity to folks who, even if they do have some criminal background.
So we had a good working group on this I think more than a year ago, and you ended up doing correspondence to the department articulating PHADA's concerns and position. I wonder if you could just talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, sure. We did send various correspondence to the secretary, some comments, including comments to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as well as HUD. And that was as the CFPB has been looking at it as that a tenant screening report is a type of consumer report. And so it's subject to the same sort of laws and rules as a credit report, where the person the report is on has the right to say, wait, that's not correct information. And their avenue, and those systems aren't set up for tenant screening reports. So they are going to be certainly pushing on that. That was something we encouraged in our comments, and we think that's really a better way to go rather than trying to dictate how an individual agency makes decisions, right? We have rules, we have policies. You have to let managers manage their property. So that's been our position. That's what we've continued to argue for, and that improvements to make the tenant screening process more fair should apply across rental housing, not just to public and assisted housing.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I was encouraged to hear that it sounds like the department will continue to recognize the need for some degree of local flexibility, given the variety of state laws that exist and the different circumstances in so many communities. But this is an issue we'll be watching closely for when this regulation comes out. I think the devil is always in the details. So you can be assured we're going to follow that closely. I do want to mention a few minutes ago, I mentioned the availability, accessibility of the PHADA staff. I think David put in the chat the email addresses for all of the PHADA staff.
Yeah.
So you can contact any of us that way if you have questions about topics on this webinar or other topics. And that's obviously not just in reference to this webinar, but at any time. Blake, were there other questions related to the criminal background checks and tenant screening?
No questions on this. Also, just wanted to follow up too on staff contacts. In the document that we've attached to this webinar, the resources, that a staff link is also available there too. Okay,
thank you, Blake. So another issue, it's kind of been on the back burner for a bit with so much happening on Inspire and HOTMA and BABA, but the department a while back issued a proposed fair housing rule with some significant changes. And I'm going to ask Julie Piccolo to briefly outline some of the concerns that we've outlined on that.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So PHADA members support the goals of the Fair Housing Act, promising to address discrimination in housing policy. And as Tim mentioned, on February 9th, 2023, HUD published the proposed Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, the AFFH. And at this time, there's an interim final rule, but there's no final rule. So the expected final rule is sometime in 2024. So PHADA has raised several major issues with HUD for the proposed rule for AFFH. And I'll cover about 4 of those issues today. So one issue is the equity plan requires unreasonable data collection, analysis, and goal setting. So for example, the equity plan will require reviewing the quality of community assets like high quality education or transportation systems. And with the example of transportation systems, housing authorities can't necessarily influence where bus lines go, but they may be able to tell port-ins where the bus stop is. And what has not been made clear for the equity plan by HUD is whether this would be reasonable or what would be reasonable in addressing identified issues. Another concern around that is, analysis areas for some of the metro housing authorities have core-based statistical areas that are vast. So Washington, D.C. is bounded by Fredericksburg, Virginia to the south and Hagerstown, Maryland to the north, and those are 120 miles away. And the Chesapeake Bay to the east and Clarksburg, West Virginia to the west, and those are 250 miles apart. So that statistical area includes that vast amount of territory and then 2 states and the District of Columbia, and is well beyond what the authority has any control over. And while HUD has an AFFH mapping tool and data tool that they're using to try to, assist in some of that data collection and planning for equity plans, the tool is covered for CDBG recipients, but is incomplete for housing authorities. And one of the changes is that HUD no longer assures housing authorities that this tool will be complete before they're required to complete the equity plan. So FADA has been advocating for a couple of actionable steps HUD could take. One would be to update the data mapping tool, which could potentially be a very powerful tool. And 2, HUD could also assist with some preliminary data crunching for some of the small and medium-sized housing authorities. A second issue is that while the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, FHEO, is working to be reasonable about implementation, there's still a lack of standards from the department for what makes an equity plan acceptable and what compliance could look like. So for example, some plans that have been approved have been 700 pages, and some plans that have been approved have been 30 pages. One great place to get some information or some examples around that is that MIT has a website that we'll share that collects the analysis of impediments and fair housing equity plans and then sorts them by status of the plan. So it could be in the draft phase, it could be reviewed, it could be accepted, or there may have been a request for some revisions. A third issue is that FADA is really concerned about HUD's capacity to be able to even review all the plans once they're submitted. So to collect 1,000 equity plans each year, review the reports, and then make recommended revisions and approve is a daunting task and requires capacity to do that, in addition to the capacity to update the AFFH tool. The final issue that, one of the final issues that FADA has been raising is kind of the arbitrary nature of including housing authorities as program participants in this rule. So part of that too is even within the distinction of among program participants, there's a one-size-fits-all approach. So what should housing authorities know, or what could they do now? So one thing that housing authorities can do is, or one thing housing authorities should know is that the existing system is still in place until there's a final rule, sometime in 2024. And that HUD's proposal will require housing authorities to submit equity plans in coordination with future due dates based on the housing authority's size. So for the largest housing authorities, that could be sometime as early as 2024. And these agencies would have about 2 years after implementation of the final rule to submit the equity plan. All agencies to have it totally complete would take between 1 to 8 years. So the second thing that housing authorities could also do is, while waiting for the final rule to be published, this could potentially be an opportunity to reach out to some of the CDBG entitlement communities to coordinate efforts and to share the burden around these equity plans. Where CDBG entitlement communities aren't available, building some relationships regionally is also a way to kind of assist with working on coordinating efforts around the equity plans.
Thank you, Julie. Suffice it to say, we have a lot of concerns with this rule. I think I read a statistic that it would take the average housing authority about 2.5 to 3 weeks to complete the plan if one person were working on. And of course, PHAs are hard pressed to keep up with all the other issues that we're discussing. So we're going to keep pressing for the department to streamline this rule and make it more workable. And as you pointed out, there's just a lot of things in that equity plan that are far beyond the control of PHAs. You've mentioned just a couple, but there's the quality of the education that's available in their community, access to jobs, parks and recreation facilities, There's just, I think, a couple of dozen, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, including zoning.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so Blake, are there questions on the fair housing rule? As Julie said, we're waiting for the department to respond to all the comments. And at this point, though that rule is not yet in effect, but rather the existing mechanisms are.
So we do have a question here from Mary Mayrose asking if you could please give a definition of an equity plan.
So on the HUD Exchange Hub website, there are some sample equity plans. So the equity plan is, the samples are there. I think it's really just measuring what's available to make sure that fair housing rules are being adhered to. So I don't know if somebody else on the call on our team has a better answer for that.
Michael?
Hey, Mary, and correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, but equity plans is just HUD's new name for the analysis of impediments. Yes. So if you've been doing analysis of impediments plans, and I used to do them before coming to PHADA as a consultant, the new rebranding is they're called equity plans.
Yes.
But it's a lot more involved than it was for the analysis of impediments.
Are there other questions on that, Blake?
That's it for the
okay. So another really important issue that PHADA has been focusing on diligently, I think, is the recent 30-day notice rule the department issued, and then concerns we have about how that impacts things like tenant account receivable. So David Weber, first question is this rule currently in effect? And if that's the case, why is HUD going through rulemaking?
Yeah, so HUD's interpretation of the CARES Act is that the requirement for a 30-day notice did not expire with the end of the national emergency. To the extent that that has gone to court, the courts appear to be mostly supporting that position. But HUD started on this process before that was clear, even before the emergency ended, in that they wanted to firmly establish this through rulemaking for the public housing and project-based rental assistance programs. I think this was sort of a backstop in case there were different decisions about the CARES Act provision. And also, while that provision is still in place, there's no enforcement or monitoring mechanism for all of the covered housing programs about what their notice periods are, because in the tax credit program and others, they appropriately defer to local law, to state and local law. But HUD wanted to put this in place. They did issue an interim final rule, which made the rule effective pending the completion of the rulemaking process. We did submit extensive comments and thank members who also submitted comments about how, this rule is not going to have its intended effect because it's one size for, 50 different ways that landlord-tenant disputes get handled. And in many cases, it's just going to lead to higher amounts owed by tenants, higher amounts not received by housing authorities, which is not covered by subsidy, and contributes, as Tim mentioned earlier, to the shortfall that some agencies may be facing. We'll certainly continue to argue that. Part of our hope is that they did get a lot of comments, thousands of comments, so it's going to take them some time to go through all those and respond. There certainly were many making similar arguments to what we presented about it being counterproductive. So they're going forward. I mean, they have it was in their tenant bill of rights. This is something that's sort of a political priority, despite the fact that it probably won't have much positive impact.
Well, I think one of the points we made in our comments was that the department is portraying this rule as a tenant protection, and I think we noted in our comments that what about the residents on the waiting list, right? They're
Yeah.
in some ways negatively impacted by this.
Right, and as it, yes, the sort of tenants on the waiting list do have to wait longer. Other tenants who are residing in the property where the housing authority has fewer resources than they have a tenant who's not paying their rent like they are, and they can't get the things repaired because there's no money. And even those tenants who are having trouble paying the rent, they just, if they extend it out further, they end up with a much larger owing balance, which
Right.
makes it harder for them to gain access to assisted housing in the future,
Right.
or to gain housing anywhere else if they have unpaid past balances to a landlord. So it has a lot of negative impacts depending on the local law, and it really should be left to that. So we continue to argue that it has lots of negative impacts. And hopefully HUD will have some common sense and see what we see on the ground.
Yeah,
This rule,
I hope so.
Federal rule isn't going to help this situation.
Well, and another thing, I hear constantly from members that this is going to even further drive up receivables. 1 in 5 PHA still are severely impacted by tenant account receivables. Can you talk just a little bit about that, and what is HUD promising to do for relief under FAS for high TARs?
Yeah, so and to address a question that was posted earlier, there was not language addressing the FAS scoring in the appropriations bill. HUD has said that they are going to provide FAS relief. Initially, they said it was going to be different from last year, although the latest was maybe it's going to be the same as last year's relief, which just changed the percentages and the scoring. It remains to be seen what that relief will look like. Clearly, there is some longer term change in that assessment scoring needed as it, things appear to, if it's leveling off at all, it's at more than twice the pre-pandemic rates of TARs. So the prior expectations just are no longer realistic, and moves like the 30-day notice and don't help that situation, unfortunately.
All right, Blake, any questions on the 30-day notice rule?
None on that right as of now.
Okay. So the last topic before we get to the other questions is section 3. I'm going to ask Julie just to talk about, there were some major changes a few years ago. And again, with everything else that's been going on, we want to make sure that agencies are aware of those changes and are keeping up with reporting. So Julie, can you briefly just outline that situation?
Sure. So the purpose of Section 3 is to provide that employment, contracting, job training opportunities for low and very low income people. So any projects that are housing rehabilitation or housing construction or other, public construction funded by HUD, where the total amount of assistance is over the threshold of $200,000, that's where Section 3 kicks in. So one of the major concerns has been, though, that there is not a reporting system in place as of the 2020 reporting. So, for projects that are currently underway, it could be that there's a potential for retroactively reporting on labor hours for the project. That would include total labor hours, Section 3 labor hours, and targeted Section 3 labor hours. So the 2020 benchmarks reporting that's in effect that housing authorities should be aware of is that the 30% new higher numerical goal has been eliminated, but it was replaced by this other tracking and eventually reporting on labor hour benchmarks. So the first labor hour benchmark is that 25% or more of the total number of labor hours worked by all HUD workers in HUD funding in a HUD funded project in the fiscal year are Section 3 workers. So you calculate that by dividing the total labor hours by the Section 3 worker labor hours. The second major benchmark is that 5% of those total number of labor hours are worked by all workers in the recipient in the targeted are worked by targeted Section 3 workers. So the 2020 rule emphasizes the priority of hiring targeted Section 3 workers, which is a person who lives in public housing or Section 8 assisted housing or is within a 1 mile radius of the project. So if safe harbor benchmarks are not achieved, then housing authorities must document and maintain their records showing the best efforts to meet the benchmarks. So some examples of that could be that the housing authority holds a hiring fair, or that there are outreach efforts to recruit participants for employment or for education or for workforce training programs or opportunities, or that there's outreach efforts to identify and secure bids from Section 3 business concerns. One thing to note is that small housing authorities with fewer than 250 units are permitted to report just the qualitative efforts. So the main takeaway I would say for Section 3 is that, note the changes on the labor hours for Section 3 workers, that there is no reporting tool and no requirement to report yet, but that there may be this retroactive reporting, and that housing authorities should really be tracking their efforts to make sure that they're engaging in order to meet the requirements.
Thank you, Julie. We encourage agencies to, again, contact our staff, consult the Advocate newsletter. There's a lot of information on the changes HUD made in Section 3, and it's a topic we'll probably be covering in future conferences as well. At this time, we want to get back to some of the other questions that were asked. David, I saw a comment on, it wasn't as much of a question as a statement. It related to small area FMRs and a concern about losing owners from participation in the voucher program because of that. You've done some work for PHADA recently on that topic. Can you just cover what the most recent developments are? And this is an issue I think we will be covering at our June meeting in New Orleans.
Yeah, so HUD did, as the last rule on FMRs required, each 5 years HUD was supposed to review the criteria to identify areas that would be mandated to use a small area FMR. They issued that notice with, I think, 42 new areas, in addition to the 25 original mandatory areas, based on things like a concentration of poverty, concentration of voucher use in low-income neighborhoods, and still some residential vacancy available. The challenge is obviously to work with your landlords and set a payment standard that can work. There is a hold harmless provision, so no existing tenant would see a reduction in the rent or subsidy based just on the changing and the adoption of a small area FMR. You continue to have the 90 to 110% range for setting your payment standard for each zip code or for groups of zip codes, as long as that zip code's FMR is in that 90 to 110% range. Then that's permissible as it is. So there is a concern. The experience of the pilot programs and the initial agencies, for the most part, was that changes in cost and things were incremental. There wasn't a drastic change all at once. And that communication with tenants and landlords and housing authorities, including in many cases bordering housing authorities, is very important in terms of finding sort of that spot where you fit the requirements, you can still afford it, and the landlords will still take the tenant. I hope that answers your question.
Blake, what other questions do we have that we have about 10 minutes to get to the remaining question?
Yes, we have one here. I was contacted by HUD React to reply regarding an Inspire. They started their inspections on October 1, 23 to state that they were asked, I guess, to reply what they were doing regarding the inspections, HQS or Inspire. She was informed in the email that their housing authority was not in compliance in notifying HUD React. And so I think her question was, she thought that HAs did not have to respond to HUD if we implemented Inspire on October 1, 2023.
Tim, I can answer that question.
Sure.
So the administrative notice for the voucher program, it did have some language related to agencies reporting when they do go to Inspire. So there was a time frame when the notice came out where you had to report that you planned to implement Inspire on October 1st, 2024, or if you had decided to implement back October 1st of 2023. But that time frame was fairly small, and so I guess my question to your field office is, you let's just say you're not in compliance, but you've implemented, they do now know. My question is, they know that you were out of compliance, but you've been implemented. So I would ask them like maybe a question that, okay, agreed, this is what I implemented, but I'm not sure what they hope to come out of that. But yes, the answer to your question is you would email them with notice when you implemented Inspire, no matter the date. But I am curious from your field office perspective, what they want from you, I guess is the question.
I'm going to
thank you.
I'm going to encourage that questioner to contact Crystal directly, because sometimes I think things can get lost in the translation of these questions in this kind of format. So
if you'd forward the email from the field office, I'll take a look.
Blake, other questions?
Yeah, this is from Mary Mayrose. I've been told that PIC will shut down April 15th, and that all users will be required to use HIP by June 1st, and that all field offices are to start preparing their PHAs beginning of March. Our field office has not said anything to date. Have you heard any of this? Anyone?
Michael?
Anyone?
Yeah. Hi, Mary. So HUD's language has always been that HIP would start rolling out to housing authorities beginning in April. I haven't heard anything that PIC is going to shut down. And again, HUD's proposed timeline, which we think is unreasonable, would be that HIP would start rolling out in April and roll out by June. If your field office is communicating this to you, like Crystal just said, reach out to me. I'm happy to get in touch with them. But again, I have not heard anything about PIC shutting down April 15th. Again, I think that aligns with HUD's proposed timeline, but it's not going to happen, quite frankly.
Yeah, and of course we have regular conversations with headquarters staff, and we can bring that question up. Okay, Blake, other questions?
Yes, this is from Jewel McIntosh. Can you please clarify what you mean by public thresholds over $300,000?
What was does it say what the content
Does
of
not.
that?
No, it might have been related to Section 3.
I think, but I do think it was in relation to Section 3, which is basically if you have a project that's less than, I think it's 200,000.
Yeah.
That's the threshold of a project where Section 3 applies. So if you're doing a $50,000 project to fix something, you don't necessarily have to do Section 3. But it's even it does apply to public housing operating though. So the thresholds are particularly around the construction projects.
I have a question I wanted to bring up, or a topic. Of course, the major focus has been on appropriations, but there's also tax legislation that's being considered in Congress. Both chambers are working on major tax bills. It's unclear whether anything's going to pass, but there are provisions related to low-income housing tax credits that FADA supports and has been working on. So Michael, can you just give us a quick update on that topic?
Yeah, Tim. So a couple of weeks ago, a bipartisan tax bill passed the House very overwhelmingly. I think it got more votes than even I expected it to. There's provisions in that related to business tax credits. There's a reinstatement of the child tax credits. And what FADA is very interested in is there are some provisions around low-income housing tax credits, which would increase the allocation of credits for, on the competitive credit side, 9%. And for non-competitive credits, it would lower the bond financing threshold from 50% to 30%. And so, like I just mentioned, it passed the House overwhelmingly a couple of weeks ago. It has hit some snags in the Senate. We think there's quite a bit of support in the Senate to get it passed. There's some senators who are somewhat apprehensive, and unfortunately, the longer it drags out, I'm afraid the chance of it passing the Senate decrease. Because certainly people are already filing their taxes this year. And there's some concern, particularly around the child tax credit, that the checks will go out too close to the election, and that could potentially influence folks' votes. And so we'll continue to keep members updated. Certainly FADA does endorse the two LIHTC provisions that are in the bill, and we do hope to see it pass soon.
Yeah. Blake, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
So we have a few more in the Q&A. I think most of these are more kind of anecdotal comments. So I'll read them off. This is from Cindy, neighbor. As for Voucher Inspire, I'm concerned about the loss of landlords, especially with rents increasing, and the possibility of the voucher program shrinking.
Yeah. Cindy, again, I hear that concern from many members, most recently in Pennsylvania when I was there 2 weeks ago for a conference. I think this is a topic the leaderships of the organizations are going to need to discuss in a couple of weeks and potentially ask for further delays because of that concern. So just be assured, we're aware of that concern. And I think that's the last thing we want to do is lose more owners.
It's a comment on Inspire. We had a high performance building go to 48% under Inspire.
I would encourage that individual to reach out to Crystal, and they can talk about some of the specifics and the reasons for that. And it might be an example that we want to bring up to REACT staff. So please contact Crystal about that.
And then this is for coming from New York regarding criminal backgrounds. The New York legislation is going to limit our access to certain information from criminal background checks, and this may complicate our ability to properly screen.
David, did you want to address that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we agree that limiting the information that's available to you to review, and it makes it harder to do effective screening. We generally, FADA has opposed that at the federal level, but again, it sort of reflects state and local is what the Fed should follow.
I think New Jersey has similar laws on the books that
they do. New Jersey passed a version of the Fair Chance at Housing Act, which delays the turnover process, among other things.
Final comment regarding smaller FMRs. We've gone to SAFMAR in our main city zip code where the majority of all our apartment units are located, and they will have a reduction of 16% over the metro FMRs. Yes, the waivers will help those on the program now in those zip codes, but it will destroy our program for new participants entering the program. They will not be able to find housing, and it's hard now, and this is going to make it more difficult.
David?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a big concern. of a lot of agencies, and we hope that it doesn't happen. I think HUD's perspective is that by increasing the payment standard in other sections of your jurisdiction is going to increase the availability in those areas, making it easier and diversifying the kinds and places of units that are available. And they would really encourage agencies to look at what can they do to make more units available in those other areas that don't have a lot of voucher use now. Is it going to an exception payment standard? Is it doing landlord outreach? And then to some extent, especially if there may be other causes for that concentration, then it starts to overlap into the affirmatively furthering fair housing considerations, because certainly HUD sees the small area FMR as a type of fair housing intervention to reduce concentration. So it's a concern. We'll continue to raise that concern and highlight it when we have examples for HUD.
Yeah. I see that comment was offered by Thomas Rowe, and I had the fortune to be in his community last year and saw some of the great things that he's doing there. And he and I and you have talked about this problem with SAFMARs in the past. And I think he offers some really good examples that I've heard similar examples from PHAs elsewhere in the country. So Thomas, we'll be talking to you more in June at our meeting, and as this evolves going forward. There's still time, I think, to influence HUD on this issue. David?
Yeah, well, I was going to say one of the other things in talking to some members that was raised is that you'll have a sense. Most people will know their town, and they'll have a sense of, are these rents on or not? Or are they way off base for what that market is in that neighborhood? And so when you see that something's off, trying to understand what are the factors that might be skewing that result. Whether it's a zip code that has really high end and really low end housing in the same zip code, ends it up in the middle, and it makes it doesn't really work either way. Or is there one property that's of a different nature of most of the rest of the housing in that zip code that changes either up or down the rent? And so when you can identify those things, that can help both in communicating to HUD and in trying to identify local sort of answers to the challenges of making sure new tenants have a place to rent and landlords still want to participate.
Thank you, David. So I'll turn it over to Blake in just a second, but I want to thank all the attendees for viewing the webinar. Again, encourage you to contact any of the staff with follow-up requests for more information, and look forward to seeing you a lot of you at upcoming state regional meetings, and certainly PHADA's meeting in early June in New Orleans. So with that, Blake, would you please conclude this with your closing remarks on this?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we would like to thank everyone. This is the conclusion of our webinar today, and we again want to extend our thanks to everyone for attending, and remind everyone as well that a recording of this webinar will be available on PHADA's website shortly. And in the meantime, we do want to remind everyone that PHADA's annual convention and exhibition will be occurring this June 2nd through 5th in New Orleans, Louisiana. Registration is now open. The hotel room reservations close May 3rd or when sold out, so we encourage you to register as soon as possible if you've not already. And so finally, in a moment, you will be redirected to a survey in Zoom, and we really do encourage you to please take this short survey. Your participation and feedback really help us in developing future webinar and other events. So again, thank you very much for attending today, and please do take the survey when you're redirected to it.